One of my regular viewers drew my attention to this tweet and asked me to look into the topic. Do the math. Never a good way to start. Trying to think if I've ever ended up agreeing with a post that started "do the math" in all caps. But I digress. Dr. Peter McCullough shows us that pre-COVID, myocarditis ran at about 4 cases per million. Post-vaccine, myocarditis is now running at 25,000 per million and rising. When will the government sound the alarm? Crickets. Honestly, I didn't especially want to look at this. My perception was that COVID is largely a past issue. It hangs around mostly because people who have made their position on the issue part of their identity over the last 3 years don't really want to let go of that thing that gave them purpose and distinctiveness, which you can understand. So I asked my community in a vote, and more than 3/4 of you said, yep, we'd quite like to see that video. So here we are. We're looking at what is the truth according to the best information we have about the vaccine and myocarditis. The state of knowledge changes gradually over time, but there has been a lot collected by this point. Now, I then immediately got a flurry of additional suggestions. Include excess deaths, include the recent Rasmussen opinion poll about American beliefs about vaccines, and more. No, no, and no. One thing at a time. Otherwise, you don't end up with a deep dive. You end up with a shallow skate or something. Besides, when it comes to the recent focus of the #DiedSuddenly phenomenon, nearly all the accusations tend to imply injury from vaccine-induced myocarditis. Myocarditis is an inflammation of the heart muscle. It can be a mild condition that quickly passes, or it can be more serious, long-lasting, or even potentially life-threatening. I looked at one piece of that puzzle in a different video. The suggestion that lots of young athletes were suddenly dropping dead because of the vaccine, and found the particular evidence source given for that to be completely unsupportive of the proposition. But all that proves is that some very poor evidence was put forward by those making that particular claim. It doesn't tell us actually what is happening. So for this, I start instead by looking at the mainstream scientific research. What does it tell us about vaccines and myocarditis? Because there are quite a lot of studies in this area. Whatever else it is, being ignored, it isn't. And then having done that, we'll consider some of the more dramatic claims, such as the one that my viewers sought to draw my attention to, and see if they have evidence supporting them above and beyond what we've looked at. Before I start on any of that, I make the necessary disclaimer. Not because of YouTube rules, not because of anything, except that it's true and it's sensible to say it. I am not a doctor, I am not a medical expert of any sort. Do not take medical advice from YouTubers, including the ones who do claim to be medical experts. I'm looking at what we know about the research in relation to public policy, the public interest stuff. Always talk to your actual doctor about the choices you make affecting your own and your family's health. So, here's the non-controversial part as far as the academic medical community is concerned. One of the most significant adverse side effects of the COVID-19 vaccines is myocarditis. Interpreting real-world evidence is complicated by the fact that one of the impacts of COVID-19 infection can also be myocarditis. So you need very good data to separate cause and effect where that is even possible. What we can say is that before the appearance on the stage of COVID-19, the estimated global incidence of acute myocarditis was between 1 to 10 cases per 100,000 people per year. That's not a static baseline that was suddenly interrupted by COVID. It's long been known to be the case that viruses can cause heart inflammation up to the point of sudden cardiac death. So you expect the figure to fluctuate around the virus profile at the time. But of course, a major global pandemic of a specific virus kicks up more cases. In early days, it was suggested that maybe COVID-19 attacked the heart more severely than other viruses. But as more and more studies appeared, it became clear that wasn't the case. And of course, we know that the vaccines can also cause myocarditis. That is also very well established. The public narrative from lawmakers and advisors has always been that outcome is usually very rare, and the balance of risk is always in favour of having the vaccine. Now, obviously, that's the key question. If you have just made up figures, a 1 in 1,000 chance of dying from a disease if you catch it, and a 1 in a million chance of dying from a vaccine that will protect you from it, that would be a no-brainer. Unless you have some other criteria, such as, religious belief or something. I mean, these things should always come down to personal choice, but we want that choice to be accurately and reliably informed. So, what does the mainstream research say? Last year, the CDC in the US released a report tracking rates of cardiac issues both after COVID infection and receiving an mRNA vaccine. The study included data from 40 health systems in the US in the calendar month of 2021 plus the first month of 2022. It identified cases of myocarditis or pericarditis within 7 days and within 21 days of COVID-19 infection, and then the same for vaccination, split out after the first dose, the second dose, unspecified dose, and any vaccine dose. And it stratified the results by age and by sex. Now, it doesn't split the results by vaccine type, which is rather important, but we'll come on to that later. Let's focus on the younger age groups and on males, because that's where the issues are known to be greater with myocarditis. Age 18 to 29 per 100,000, they reported 100 cases. Following COVID infection, 8.1 cases after a first vaccine dose, 15 after a second, 27.8 after an unspecified dose. Age 12 to 17, again per 100,000, they said there were 64.9 cases after COVID infection, 3.3 after first dose. That goes up significantly to 35.9 cases after a second, 29.7 after unspecified. Age 5 to 11, after infection, 17.6, so significantly lower. 4 after a first vaccine dose, 0 after a second, 6.5 after an unspecified dose. On that basis, the data suggested that rates of myocarditis and pericarditis in boys was greater within 21 days of infection than within 21 days of any dose of mRNA vaccine. The data also suggests that the vast majority of events happened really quite quickly, within 7 days of either infection or vaccination. So that was the CDC. What other research is out there? One of the largest studies published to date came from Israel, with over 2 million people assessed. The cases of myocarditis detected, the majority of which was in males aged 16 to 29, where there were 10.69 cases per 100,000 people versus just 2 if you averaged the figures out, as some reporters did. 76% of those cases were classified as mild, 22% were intermediate. 1 case developed cardiogenic shock, and 10 had some heart dysfunction remaining at the time of discharge. The UK government data reports that as of 2nd of March 2022, there were 739 reports of myocarditis, 507 of pericarditis, following the use of the Pfizer-BioNTech vaccine, and 221 of myocarditis and 216 of pericarditis following the Moderna vaccine. Now, those are total numbers. Worth noting that a lot more people were vaccinated with Pfizer than with Moderna, so the raw numbers don't reflect the relative risk. For that, we have data showing cases per million doses. Age 14 to 18, only Pfizer was used, which produced 14 after the first dose, 12 after the second. Age 18 to 29, 24 after a first Pfizer dose, 28 after a second, 58 after a first Moderna dose, 70 after a second. So still small numbers, 58 per million, but significantly higher for Moderna there. And that is the highest risk group on that data, which is the MHRA yellow card reporting data. At the end of last year, a paper by Knudsen and Prasad reviewed the research on vaccine-induced myocarditis specifically and found a total of 27 studies. They identified which ones actually gave stratified information over 4 factors: sex, age, dose number, and vaccine manufacturer, and only 8 of them used all 4, with 13 using 1 or none, which makes them barely useful at all, frankly. They said that the highest incidence of myocarditis came from studies that break the data down by stratifiers, but it looks a lot higher in 16-year-old men than other groups, and with a particular spike after the second dose of the Moderna vaccine by the 28-day mark. Indeed, risk for that category is up to 30 times higher than the averaged figures usually quoted when people are promoting the vaccines, which is one of those things that makes people concerned about the quality of information they're being given. It's worth noting that this research has certainly fed through into at least some of the guidelines, which advocated for not using Moderna for vaccination for people under the age of 30. For instance, as early as November 21, that included Germany and France, as well as all the Scandinavian countries. And that seems like a nuanced, evidence-based response to what the research seems to say. None of the evidence seems to justify moral panic of any sort, but nevertheless a prudent, risk-based approach to say that you would avoid the use of Moderna for that age group. That would certainly be justified. Part of the legitimate problem with this is the history of disclosure by health authorities, particularly in the US, who have been in campaigning mode rather than public information mode, because that has the effect of eroding trust. So in April 2021, the CDC denied there was any link to myocarditis in young males and the vaccines. CDC head Rochelle Walensky said, "We have not seen a signal, and we've actually looked intentionally for the signal in the over 200 million doses we've given." That was in spite of the fact that the Israel study had come out 2 months earlier, in spite of the fact that more than 4/5 of those 200 million doses were with older people already known not to be in the high-risk group for myocarditis. And in spite of the fact that the US Department of Defense had detected 14 cases amongst people who were vaccinated through the military's health services. By June of that year, the evidence from subsequent studies had become impossible to ignore. Walensky posted comments downplaying any suggestion that it was serious. To put this into perspective, if we vaccinate 1 million 12 to 17-year-olds, we could see 30 to 40 mild cases of myocarditis. In this same 1 million, through vaccination, we avoid 8,000 cases of COVID-19, 200 hospitalizations, 50 ICU stays, and 1 death. The benefits far outweigh the risks. Now, some in the medical community kicked back hard against that particular campaign message. For example, the Johns Hopkins professor, Dr. Marty Makary, who said, "This calculus is radically different for healthy kids versus kids with a pre-existing health condition. This is a very misleading representation of data, non-stratified by risk factors, outdated base rates, low completion rate from self-reported data, and ignores child deaths from second dose." Simone Scott Jacob Clinic. "I'm pro-vax, 1 dose in kids, but wrong to misrepresent data to push vax." And that's sort of the point. It wasn't that the research suggested a massive imbalance in risk, but the use of misleading information by a CDC in campaigning mode meant that you didn't have to be one of the more excitable figures on this issue to lose trust in what you were being told. Add to that the fact that Biden's administration rushed to push towards booster shots for all in advance of a scientific process, leading to the resignation in protest of 2 of the top vaccine reviewers of the CDC, Marion Gruber and Philip Krauss, and it made it all the more clear that the campaign was getting ahead of the science. In a paper published after their resignation, they said that the rush to boost at that time was getting ahead of evidence that it would confer actual additional benefit, and pointed to the incidences of myocarditis as potential risk factors that became unjustified if the boosters weren't actually doing any good. This becomes relevant again now, of course, because most of that discussion was carried out in relation to the earlier Alpha and Delta strains of COVID, deadlier in impact and against which the vaccines were highly effective in reducing serious illness. With Omicron now the dominant strain, the harm caused by COVID still to be taken seriously. Omicron kills people, but it is less than the early strains. And also the vaccines currently have reduced impact in preventing infection and serious disease against Omicron. Still pretty good protection, but those two factors together mean you re-evaluate the risk-reward equation for the vaccines today. For most age groups, it's still mathematically a no-brainer. The vaccines provide significantly more benefit than they do currently detected risk. I put it that way because we still don't know exactly whether there are long-term risks, but we have a lot of real-world data now, so we're certainly clearer than we were a year ago. But there are certainly some, Knudsen and Prasad for instance, who hold that given the current figures, it's not unreasonable to calculate that for the highest at-risk group of young men, it's actually not worth vaccinating them. I am in no position to know whether they're right about that. There are some who will certainly dispute it, but it's obviously a lot closer a calculation than it was. But none of that, you might notice, justifies those highly excitable takes on all this. So let's have a look at those and see what the mainstream might be missing. Let's go back to that tweet that started this process off, based on claims being made by Peter McCullough. It's linked to a video that linked to a paper from Finland, Occurrence and Features of Childhood Myocarditis, a nationwide study in Finland, published in 2017. 4 cases per million, background rate, before COVID. Then it goes through a number of intermediary papers with estimates post-vaccination broadly in line with what we've been discussing here, but then that leaps wildly with his last cited papers. It's only then we get the real headline figure. So this one, Mansangwan et al., cardiovascular manifestation of the BNT162b2 mRNA COVID-19 vaccine in adolescents, where he claims that the study shows cases running at 25,000 cases per million for 13 to 18-year-olds. Also corroborated, he says, by this paper, Incidence non négligeable de myocarditis après troisième dose de vaccin. Well, that would indeed be a remarkable finding, so let's just take a look and see if these papers support it. This first one is a study with adolescents in Thailand. 301 participants enrolled from 2 schools. Myopericarditis was confirmed in 1 patient after vaccination. 2 patients had suspected pericarditis. 4 patients had suspected subclinical myocarditis. So what it seems McCullough has done here is to take all of those as confirmed. Out of 300 participants, that would make 1 case equivalent to 3,333 cases per million. So with 7 cases, you come out at 23,333 per million, which is rather close then to his 25,000 per million figure. Do I really need to highlight what's wrong with that proposition? First, this is a tiny study. I mean, it can be well conducted, it can be poorly conducted. With such tiny numbers in cases, to then extrapolate from those to worldwide rates is just ridiculous. If you have studies in the US and Israel and UK with far, far larger numbers of cases looked at, why would you give the most weight to a study of 300 from Thailand that has outlandishly divergent figures, mostly of suspected, not confirmed cases? It's not what you do if you're serious about finding out what's going on. Might be what you do if you're aiming for the most social media clout. But that's the Thai study. What about the French one? Well, this is something of an odd study because its results seem to fly in the face of just about everything else we know. Firstly, it's not a study looking at the impact of vaccines on young men. The study population was 69% women with an average age of 37 years old. It sought to identify mild myocardial injury that normally wouldn't be picked up, because the statistics are generally made up of those hospitalised for myocarditis. They determined that 2.8% of the study group experienced these mild myocardial lesions, which would be 800 times higher than the usual incidence of full-blown extreme myocarditis. No problems, 0 were detected in the study group at the 30-day stage. Now look, that's interesting and worthy of further study. It suggests there's an apparently mild and temporary impact on women in older groups that may be nothing to worry about, but should be investigated further because you never know. If you drew attention to it in those terms, it would be fair comment. What it isn't is a like-for-like comparison that justifies McCullough taking a baseline figure for full-blown acute myocarditis to suggest that this is evidence that there's now 25,000 cases per million. So that immediately comes across as one side grasping at whatever random studies can be misreported to get the most dramatic figure possible, not the sort of voice you should take as a reliable narrator. That's not to say the studies don't present real information of concern, and they can be contrasted against the apparent failure, for instance, of Pfizer to meet a deadline to carry out and report on subclinical myocarditis impacts of its vaccine. That failure should absolutely be highlighted, particularly in relation to these concerning studies. This is the frustrating thing we see again and again in this area. There is a genuine critique to be made, obviously. Based on the real-world information, the authorities can be highly criticised for their past messaging and conduct. But when the critics steam right on past that station and keep on going, maybe they get viral videos for a core audience, but the power of those criticisms get lost because they end up spouting demonstrable nonsense that simply undermines the case. Alright, what else is there in this space? Well, there's one video by Dr. John Campbell that argues that a study from Israel shows zero enhanced myocarditis from COVID-19 infection.
But it's very important, and it's from Israel before vaccination for COVID-19 was introduced. And what it did, it looked at a large cohort of people who'd had COVID, diagnosed by PCR, a large group of people as a control that had not had COVID, who never had symptoms and tested negative on PCR, and they compared the incidence of myocarditis and pericarditis between the two groups. And what they found is there was no difference between the groups. So the COVID group did not have more myocarditis and pericarditis than the group who'd never had the COVID infection.
So he argues, or at least implies, that the enhanced incidences of myocarditis must therefore all be down to the vaccines. I'm not sure you would jump straight to that conclusion, but let's first of all check the study, make sure that it says what he describes. Because my impression is that this is all very well studied and the connection is pretty robust. So here is the study, the incidence of myocarditis and pericarditis in post-COVID-19 unvaccinated patients. The first thing I note is that it says, we aim to study the incidence of post-acute COVID-19 myocarditis and pericarditis. Post-acute. Curious to know what that means. I read the paper, and it turns out they only looked at people from 10 days after they tested positive. They were wanting to know whether they developed myocarditis post-virus recovery, not during the actual acute phase of the virus itself, which is where you get the most myocarditis. So while there might be some interesting angles there to look at longer term effects on all sides of this equation, it's clearly not showing what John Campbell claimed it was showing. And that's not really surprising because there are a number of pretty solid papers showing that COVID-19 damages the heart and describing the mechanism whereby it does it. Talking about autopsy results on patients that died of COVID-19, showing that 31% of them had a high viral load in the heart, confirming that SARS-CoV-2's entry into cells via the ACE2 receptor makes it more dangerous to heart cells. Other studies have shown that, quote, cardiac injury, as reflected by concentrations of troponin, a cardiac muscle-specific enzyme, in the blood, is common with COVID-19, occurring in at least 1 in 5 hospitalized patients and more than half of those with pre-existing heart conditions. And it goes on to talk about myocarditis specifically. More worrisome than the pattern of limited injury is myocarditis. Unlike SARS-associated myocarditis, that's the viral precursor to COVID, SARS, which did not exhibit lymphocyte infiltration, this immune and inflammatory response is a typical finding at autopsy after SARS-CoV-2 infections. So, look, there are diminishing returns to all this. The basic pattern emerging is that, yes, myocarditis is a feature of COVID-19. Yes, myocarditis is a feature of COVID vaccinations, particularly affecting young men. There could be more detail on that, other areas of concern. Suggestions that the degree of myocarditis are not the same for different causes, for instance, is something that I've seen suggested. Yes, there should be an active program of calmly but thoroughly investigating potential areas of concern. And as regular viewers know, I have been a consistent supporter of the basis of personal choice in whatever medical treatments you do and you don't take. It would be an easier position to take if there wasn't so much rampant, genuine disinformation all about the place. But the point is that, yes, the vaccines have been effective and were able to be developed remarkably quickly, but they are novel technology. mRNA vaccines have massive potential. I look forward particularly to seeing if they can tackle, as seems likely, one of the big global killers, namely malaria. But it's not an inherently unreasonable position if some people are cautious about using such technology at such an early stage of its emergence. I've looked at people like Novak Djokovic, not telling what other people should do, not, so far as I'm aware anyway, making outlandish claims as some people have, just quietly choosing his own position to not be vaccinated. And there's a lot to be said to the public authorities that have demonised that position. The fact that Djokovic, even now, can't travel to America to take part in tennis tournaments there, which is just ridiculous. He is the most public face of that demonisation and the damage and polarisation that all of that has cost us. And if that caution turns out to be justified on grounds that we haven't yet identified, our ability to register that is probably made incalculably more difficult by the fact the discussion has been dominated by two extreme sides taking chunks out of each other with minimal care on both sides to the actual evidence. And you know, if you've decided you'll never trust what the government says ever again because they were wrong, then why do you keep believing the people on the other side who are also constantly wrong? I get asked, oh, this person has said this, can you check it out? Okay, no, that's wrong. Okay, thanks. But now he said something else. What about that? Well, that's wrong as well. Great, thanks. Oh, now he said this other thing. Really? Bear in mind, any of us can be wrong. All of us can and surely will make mistakes at some point. Trust the people who, when that happens, they post a correction. Oh, it's been brought to my attention. I was wrong about this thing. Here's the corrected version. For people who are constantly wrong and never admit it, they are not the ones you should be going to for your information. All right, rant over. What we see from the myocarditis question is a confirmation of what we already knew. The harm from COVID-19 is massively influenced more than any other factor, including vaccination status, by the way, by age. The more limited but genuine harms from the vaccines go in the opposite direction. They are more serious, albeit at low levels, for the young. One might have a grown-up discussion about that if we weren't instead chasing nonsense. In the UK, it's been announced that we are now moving past the emergency phase to a more standard one, and that apparently means that the vaccine will now no longer be routinely offered to people below the age of 50. We might take that as a quiet recognition of exactly that balance of risk question that I'm referring to. Just wondering why it took so long. All right, feel free to look at the extensive list of references for this episode. Let me know in the comments if you believe I missed something that has a solid evidence trail behind it.